Hi everyone, and welcome to our first big note-taking video. So as you can see, we got a little different of a setup this time. I'm in a little corner. We got the whole Agile Mind setup alongside an example version of a notebook page. So this one, I'm going to do a combination of typing and a combination of writing. Obviously, you can't really type directly onto your notebook pages, but that's just to make my handwriting super legible so it's not any issues of handwriting that are causing problems. Okay, we haven't really made notebook pages together before. The idea was I didn't really know if everyone had a notebook page, right? I wanted to give you time to be able to get those at the main office. They should hopefully still be available. And I wanted to give you time to be able to set up your interactive notebook for when we talk about that too, okay? But hopefully we've all had the time to set up a notebook to go over the set up your interactive notebook assignment, right? So now I can really explicitly talk about these things instead of just kind of having you do them alone, all right? Um, and let's go over them so we can not only, I will help you with these in the future, but hopefully we can also build towards being able to figure these out ourselves, right? So let's start with what is our essential question, right? Well, this video is about bisectors. That was our lesson, right? So my essential question, whenever I'm introducing a new topic, is often going to be, what is it and how is it useful to us, right? So in this case, that's going to be, what are bisectors and how are they useful, right? Boom, right off the bat, got our essential question. Now our learning target, okay, our learning target is what are we going to be able to say or do by the end of this? Notice it's a learning target, so it's often going to be how would I explain it, right? How would I understand it? How would I convey my understanding? So here it's going to be we can define bisectors. Mhm. Notice the language target doesn't need to specifically care about the useful part. The useful part is going to come into our reflection and summary later. The idea of being able to reflect on why we were talking about what we were talking about, right? Next up, let's talk about our questions for the day, right? The topics, the note topics, and these are going to be built out of the essential questions. So if I'm asking what are bisectors, my two parts to that are going to be, okay, what are angle bisectors, right? What are angle bisectors? And what are perpendicular bisectors? Notice I like to phrase these as questions, right? You don't need to, but I like to phrase them as questions. And you're going to see it really helps us understand what in the notes that we want to take, right? Out of the Agile Mind notes, what are we going to transcribe in our notebook? The phrasing it as a question really helps answer that for us, okay? So now let's jump into answering this first question. What are angle bisectors? And remembering our essential questions, how are they useful? What are they? And we can define them is our language target, right? So scanning over this, I immediately see a definition right here, defined as a line, ray, or segment that divides the angle into two angles with equal measures. I also see that it says, in other words, an angle bisector divides the angle into two congruent angles, right? So I'm going to want to try to convey that in my notes in a second. But let's also move around the page a bit, see if there's anything else. So we had the construction here, right? And then we saw they made the bisection with the construction, that's right. And then we also were able to talk about how the angles are congruent because they have the same measures, good. And then remembering also we talked about the idea of, oh yeah, if I pick any points along this bisector line, they're going to be the same distance away from the two sides, right? That was another thing we discovered, that these points along this line are the same distance away from the two sides of the angle. So that one's also covered in the Agile Mind notes. The ones I suggested on the slides on the Pear Deck, those slides covered some of the activities we did. So I could check those out later to be able to remind myself of those activities because those activities weren't on the Pear Deck slides, right? Okay, so now let's transcribe this in the form of notes, okay? So I'm gonna go back over here again. I'm typing because I wanna make sure my handwriting is legible completely, but you all would probably be writing this, or maybe you're typing it on Google Docs, I don't know. And I'm gonna write a version of what we have on Agile Mind, making it make more sense for me, but capturing all the essential details, right? So I'm gonna say an angle bisector is a line, ray, or segment that divides an angle into two congruent angles, right? And then I'm gonna add as well that all points on the angle bisector are equidistant from the angle's two sides. Okay, now, notice my notes look a lot like the ones that I took over here, right, on Agile Mind, but they're not, they're shorter, they're more concise. So let's talk about why I took out some things and what I kept, right? I don't need to say that they're two angles with equal measures because I know what congruency is. We've taken notes on congruency, right? If I wanted to remind myself, right, to make sure I remembered this, I could do that, absolutely. And I would do that with a parenthetical like this. Angles with equal measures, right? So I could add a parenthetical there to help me remember. Why didn't I? Well, I didn't want to say an angle into two congruent angles with equal measures, right, without a parenthetical, because then it might not be clear to me that congruency implies that, right, that I didn't need to say that. All congruent angles have equal measures. And I didn't take this parenthetical because I remembered that. I knew I had it in my notebook. If you feel like that's the kind of thing that you're going to want to remember more, right, then maybe that's the kind of thing that you would put in your notebook, right? That's up to you. No, I got to remove it all. There we go. Okay. So that parenthetical is up to you, but I didn't need it, right? So I didn't take it. Now let's add the picture so we can remember this a little easier. So I'm going to copy this picture over there almost exactly, right? I'm just going to put that down in my notebook like so. Got my two sides, right? Going to give them little arrows to indicate that they're rays. And then I'm going to add my other bisector ray, right? So this line right, I mean this ray right here is my bisector. Now I need to add my points, right? So that's X. Then over here, I'm going to add A. Excellent. And then I'm going to add my angle indicators, remembering that they both have one arc, which is a way of remembering that they're congruent, right? So maybe I would take notes on that if I want to remember that. The one arc means they're congruent angle measures, or congruent angles with equal angle measures, right? And then I might take the extra notes down here as well. I am also going to add the thing about the side lengths as well, right? So I'll make a line for my side lengths. And I will also remember what we're about to talk about too, which is that this single dash indicates congruency, right? So that's how I can indicate that the side lengths are congruent, distance from the two sides, right? Good. That's it. That's my notes for that one, right? So now let's talk about perpendicular bisectors. Again, breaking it down into what are the things that we need to take in the notes. So I've previously told the story that when I first started taking notes, I had a really bad habit of taking way too many notes, right? And that's why I really like this method with taking just the notes that answer your questions, because it means I'm only taking the notes that I absolutely have to. I really can break down what's important to keep and what's not. And this one right here is going to be really, really important to break down what's important to keep and what's not. Because look at all the different things that we're introducing here, but I only have one question. What are perpendicular bisectors, right? So this first paragraph is about perpendicular lines. I don't need to take notes on that, right? If I feel like I might need to remember that, sure, maybe I'll take notes on that, but we should know perpendicularity from middle school probably, so I'm not going to. This paragraph really directly answers perpendicular bisector, right? It tells me exactly what it is, so I'm going to take notes on that probably, but maybe remove a couple things. We talk about that the segments are congruent. That's good. Down here, we talk about the midpoint, also good, but not answering my question, right? I might take notes on that if I need to remember it, but I think the definition of perpendicular bisector is going to help me remember what a midpoint is, right? And that's exactly what we got here. So I'm going to take notes on this part as well, probably. Now I'm going to capture my picture. So let's do that together. Got my two, got my line segment. I got my line, right? My perpendicular line. Going to indicate my angle here. Going to indicate congruency here. Now I need to add my points. Notice I'm being very careful to make A and B the endpoints, right? I don't want anything to be past them. So I got to be very careful that I'm accurately drawing that so there's no part of the segment going past it. I might be able to just remember that. It doesn't need to be perfect in my picture, but it's important to try to get those details captured in mathematics to practice making our sketches really accurate, okay? There we go. That wasn't too bad, right? And now let's add our definition. So I'm going to extract only the relevant information from the paragraphs on the left, right? So I see a perpendicular bisector is a line ray or segment that intersects another line segment at a right angle and divides the line segment into two smaller segments of equal length. I also see the perpendicular bisector of a line segment is perpendicular to the segment and passes through its midpoint, right? So let's take notes on that. I've got a perpendicular bisector is a line, ray, or segment that intersects another line segment at a right angle, right? Now, do I want to say that? Yeah, I do, right? I would want to remember that because it'll help you remember what perpendicular is later, right? The right angle part. But I'm going to change this next part. Instead of saying divides it into two segments of equal length, I'm going to do what I did last time. I'm going to say and passes through its midpoint, dividing it into two congruent segments, right? Now, I actually forgot to take notes on that. Over here, there was another part I wanted to highlight that I genuinely just forgot. So let's add that, let's fix that. Right here is where I took that last bit from. The midpoint of a line segment, oh, sorry. The midpoint of a line segment is a point on the line segment that is equidistant from each endpoint and divides it into two congruent segments. So see there, I'm building off this idea of two smaller segments of equal length, which I know means congruent, but I'm adding it into the definition of a midpoint, right? So I can understand what a midpoint is and remember that later by building it into the definition of a perpendicular bisector. So maybe I would want to, underline midpoint, right? Midpoint, and underline at a right angle to help me remember those things if I need to review my notes to remember that later, right? Because that's not what I'm answering with this essential question, but those are things I might check my notebook for, and this would help me remember. If I really feel like I'm going to need that, maybe I do add that as a part of my notes, right? I can add a little bullet point and talk about those things, right? But I don't feel like I'm going to need it, so I'm not going to. Now, the last thing we got is our reflection, right? And that should hopefully be pretty quick as well. So we're going to reflect like we did at the end of the lesson before. Oh, actually, there's one more thing we need for perpendicular bisectors, the activity we did, right? Again, that's going to be covered on the rest of the Agile Mind. So if I was to go to some of the future pages, we can check that out, right? Going to the next couple pages, I can see that it talks about how to construct them, making some conjectures about them, right? Talking about these points and noticing that they're equidistant, right? So I could remember that by going to Agile Mind later. But for now, let's quickly review that, right? The idea was if I was to get these distances from any point on my perpendicular bisector, let me use the line tool, any point on my perpendicular bisector, right? Those distances are going to be equidistant, right? Or in other words, those segments are going to be congruent. Nice. So that's something I need to add in my notebook as well, remembering that, right? I'm going to say all points on the perpendicular bisector are equidistant from the two endpoints of the segment it bisects, right? Which sounds kind of fancy, so maybe you might write that a little differently. I could say, perpendicular bisectors are all the points equidistant from the two endpoints. I could have just said that probably, right? But I'm going to be really clear so I can remember that. And the picture will help too, hopefully, right? So now in my reflection, right, I'm going to talk about what was important, what was useful about bisectors, answering that big question, which is more of a reflection kind of question. So I'm going to say, bisectors help us divide angles and line segments into two congruent parts. They also help us find all the points that are equidistant from two sides of an angle or two endpoints of a segment. And I'm actually going to change that. I don't need all the detail there. I'm going to say equidistant from two sides or 2 points, right? Because I can make the angle or make the segment to care about that. But I don't need to remember that part for my reflection. And there's another thing that's important about bisectors. They can also go the other way and vice versa, right? They can prove congruency and they can show points are equidistant from two other things. Wow. So again, like we talked about in class, right, there's a lot of use for bisectors. They can do 4 different things in mathematics, right? So there's a lot of things that bisectors are very useful for, which means that we're going to talk about them a lot, right? And that's why that reflection is very good. It helps us figure out how are we going to connect this to things in the future and when might we use bisectors? Because one of the most common questions I get in math class, right, is what am I supposed to do here? I need the first step. And knowing what bisectors are used for gives you an idea, a prompt of what tool in your toolbox you would use for a problem, right? So there you go. There's all our notes for this class, right? We got the essential questions, our language target, 2 questions to answer, the 2 kinds of bisector, and our reflection with some pictures and some text. Okay? I will have this notebook saved, so you can absolutely just check this out later at your own leisure, okay? And you can check this video out at any time, all right? If you have any questions, please email me. Please let me know, message me via Canvas, okay? Or bring it up in our Zoom meetings and let me know there, all right? Hope you have a great day.